The infrastructure paradox: why Kenya's concrete didn't feed the economy. Section 1: the sequel hook and the paradox. Over the last decade, Kenya underwent an unprecedented physical transformation. We laid thousands of kilometers of tarmac, constructed the Nairobi Expressway, and engineered the Standard Gauge Railway, the largest capital infrastructure project in our independent history. Yet, as the concrete dried, a deep public frustration emerged. While the state pointed to magnificent infrastructure milestones, the ordinary citizen asked a simple, painful question: why can't we eat roads and railways? Critics often blame the infrastructure itself, calling it a waste of public funds. But looking through a strict economic lens, the problem isn't that we built the infrastructure. The problem is that we forgot to build the business environment required to make that infrastructure profitable. We invested heavily in the physical chassis of a modern economy, but completely broke the regulatory engine. And right now, the stakes are higher than ever. As the current administration pushes forward with a multi-billion-shilling SGR extension to Kisumu and Malaba, while resuscitating the ambitious LAPSSET Corridor to Ethiopia and South Sudan, Kenya is locked in a high-stakes infrastructure war with Tanzania for control over East Africa's multi-trillion-shilling trade corridors. In this final part of our trilogy, we look at the infrastructure paradox, why Kenya's trillions in concrete have failed to deliver a return, and what must be done right now to turn these debt-heavy liabilities into wealth-generating assets. Section 2: a hard versus soft infrastructure. To understand why economic returns failed to materialize, we must separate infrastructure into two distinct categories: hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. Hard infrastructure consists of the physical concrete, steel, and tarmac. Soft infrastructure consists of the regulatory frameworks, predictable tax regimes, affordable utility costs, and institutional efficiencies that allow businesses to utilize those physical structures. When a country builds hard infrastructure, it is taking a massive, debt-driven gamble. The economic theory states that a new railway will lower transport costs, which will encourage a local entrepreneur to open a factory, which will create thousands of jobs, which will expand the tax base naturally to pay off the initial debt. But this chain reaction only works if the soft infrastructure is healthy. If you build a multi-billion-shilling railway line to move goods, but a manufacturer cannot access affordable electricity, faces a constantly shifting tax code, and experiences systemic clearing delays at the port, the railway becomes irrelevant. The hard infrastructure is there, but the soft infrastructure makes production too expensive to justify using it. Section 3: the SGR file and the multiplier effect failure. Let us look objectively at the Standard Gauge Railway as a prime case study. From an engineering and transit perspective, the SGR achieved its physical goals. It dramatically reduced passenger and cargo transit times between Mombasa and Nairobi. However, its economic design suffered from two massive structural blind spots. First was the leakage of the multiplier effect. When a state spends hundreds of billions of shillings on a domestic project, that money is supposed to circulate locally, enriching local steel manufacturers, local engineers, and local contractors. However, because the SGR was financed through restrictive bilateral debt, the vast majority of that capital was immediately paid out to foreign contractors, foreign labor, and foreign suppliers. The debt remained in Kenya, but the cash flow went right back overseas. Second was the reliance on administrative coercion over market efficiency. Early on, the state forced clearing agents and importers to use the rail through executive directives. In economics, whenever you have to force people to use an asset via bureaucratic decrees rather than price competitiveness, it is a sign of an artificial economic model. This heavy-handed approach increased logistical friction, driving up total costs for businesses instead of lowering them. Section 4 is the lessons we can borrow. History teaches us that infrastructure does not create wealth in a vacuum, it merely acts as an accelerator for existing productivity. When the United States constructed its massive interstate highway system in the 1950s, the economic boom didn't happen just because asphalt was poured. It happened because the American government paired the highways with policies that lowered barriers to interstate trade, kept fuel costs highly competitive, and allowed industries to organically set up logistics hubs anywhere along the routes. The infrastructure succeeded because it served an expanding, highly competitive private sector. Contrast that with Kenya's approach over the past decade. We treated infrastructure as the primary driver of GDP growth itself. We assumed that building the road would magically create the business. But roads don't create businesses. Predictable policies, affordable capital, and market demand create businesses. The infrastructure is simply the pipeline. If your policies are suffocating the producers, the pipeline remains empty. Section 5 is the future play, the Kisumu-Malaba extension and the Tanzania threat. This brings us to the modern dilemma. The current administration has committed over 500 billion shillings to extend the SGR through Phase 2B and 2C, running from Naivasha through Kisumu and onwards to the Uganda border at Malaba. Skeptics point to our existing debt and ask, why spend more? But macroeconomics gives us a counterintuitive answer. Kenya has no choice but to finish the railway. Leaving the SGR terminating at a dry port in Naivasha was an economic half-measure. An unfinished railway is purely a cost. A completed international corridor linking the port of Mombasa directly to the Great Lakes region is a strategic asset. The extension is mandatory to finally capture the massive transit freight of landlocked Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC. Furthermore, this is a race against time. Tanzania has been aggressively building its own electrified SGR network from Dar es Salaam toward Mwanza and Kigoma, actively trying to divert landlocked regional trade away from the northern corridor. If Kenya fails to extend its rail network to Malaba to provide a cheaper, frictionless transit route for regional neighbors, the port of Mombasa risks losing its historical dominance as the gateway to East Africa. Section 6, the LAPSSET Corridor, pipe dream or future economic lifeline. If the Western Extension is about defending our existing trade, the LAPSSET Corridor, spanning Lamu Port, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, is about opening an entirely new economic frontier. This massive $22 billion blueprint includes a 3,000-kilometer regional rail network, oil pipelines, and highways designed to unlock Kenya's northern counties. The pros are revolutionary. LAPSSET offers landlocked Ethiopia, a market of over 120 million people, and oil-rich South Sudan an alternative strategic gateway to the sea, while structurally bringing marginalized northern Kenyan communities into the mainstream economy. However, the economic cons are heavily tied to timing and geopolitical risk. Executing a megacorridor across regions facing volatile security challenges requires immense capital that a heavily indebted national treasury cannot afford to borrow traditionally. Relying heavily on public-private partnerships, PPPs, and slow-moving bilateral agreements has kept major elements, like the crude oil pipeline, locked in feasibility loops. LAPSSET proves that global-scale planning is magnificent, but without immediate, localized economic viability, it remains a heavy financial burden on the state's books.
Section 7, the remedies are accelerating the return. So, how does Kenya unlock the trapped economic value inside its massive infrastructure assets? We must pivot our entire policy focus from building more concrete to optimizing the concrete we already have. First, transforming rail nodes into special economic zones, SEZs. We must stop treating the Kisumu Port and Lamu Port as mere transit stops. They must be aggressively designated as special economic zones. The state must provide long-term tax holidays, streamlined single-window customs clearances, and cheap subsidized electricity specifically for manufacturing and agro-processing farms that set up inside these logistics hubs. If you bring the factories to the rail nodes, the infrastructure transforms into a highly profitable industrial conveyor belt. Second, radical improvement of the local business environment. To justify the cost of the SGR extension and LAPSSET, the government must lower the cost of doing business domestically. This means harmonizing national and county taxes, maintaining a predictable tax code, and actively working within the East African community to eliminate non-tariff trade barriers at our borders. We must make it cheaper to produce a good inside Kenya than it is to import it. Third, transitioning to last-mile agricultural connectivity. The era of mega-trillion-shilling trunk infrastructure must be put on a disciplined pause. The national treasury and county governments must align their planning to focus purely on last-mile connectivity. This means investing in agricultural feeder roads, rural cold storage facilities, and county aggregation centers that connect smallholder farmers directly to our major highway corridors, cutting out predatory middlemen and reducing food waste. Fourth, slashing the bureaucratic cost of logistics. The efficiency of the SGR is heavily bottlenecked by the soft infrastructure at our ports and borders. We must completely digitize and streamline customs clearance processes, eliminate redundant regional inspection barriers, and make the port of Mombasa a frictionless, single-window entry point. Our logistics network must win on cost and speed, not on state mandates. Fifth, shifting focus to last-mile feeder networks. While we execute these grand cross-border corridors, economic planning must prioritize linking local producers to the main lines. Trillion-shilling trunk routes are useless if a local farmer cannot get their produce to the aggregation hub due to broken rural feeder roads. True economic returns materialize when local agriculture and small businesses are frictionlessly connected to the global pipelines. Section 8, the Trilogy conclusion. Over these three analyses, we have looked at the complete machinery of Kenya's economic architecture. We saw how a dominant national treasury sidelined long-term economic planning. We saw how decentralized devolution fragmented our local markets into 47 uncoordinated zones. And today, we see how an overinvestment in hard concrete without a healthy soft business environment left us with a mountain of debt and a cash-strapped economy. The lesson across all three pillars is exactly the same: a nation cannot tax, borrow, or build its way into prosperity. It must plan its way there. The solution out of our current economic bottleneck is not to abandon development, but to restore the intellectual, disciplined balance between fiscal management and strategic growth. What are your thoughts on this infrastructure debate? How can Kenya better utilize the SGR to drive local manufacturing? Will the SGR extension to Malaba or the LAPSSET Corridor successfully position Kenya ahead of regional competitors? Let's have a data-driven, constructive conversation in the comments below. If you haven't watched part 1 and part 2 of this structural series, click the playlist on your screen right now to see how the entire puzzle fits together. Thank you for watching, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next analysis.